Thank you for that prayer. That's a very nice prayer, and I just want all of, the continue button here. I just want all of you to know that if all my students at school were like all of you, I might never retire. I got about seven. I'm counting the next 7 years though. At the meantime, but like I said, that would change if I had all students like this group here. Never mind, I wouldn't even know what time it was. But anyway, I'm thankful for all of you. So Daniel chapter 8 starts in the 3rd year of Belshazzar, and this is another vision that Daniel's going to have. And that year, according to the commentators and some other Bibles, would be about 550 BC. What's interesting about that is in that 3rd year, at 550 BC, around that time is when Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia, began to consolidate his empire with the Persians and the Medes. And that's very significant for the first part of this vision that Daniel has, dealing with the Persians and the Medes. Now, the good part, the easy part about Daniel chapter 8 is that first we see the vision, what Daniel has, but then he gets an explanation for what all of that means. So we won't have to spend a lot of time breaking it down when we go through the vision because, well, the book does it for us. However, we will look a little bit deeper into the secular history that the book is referring to. So stay tuned for that. Now, some explanations here. Daniel was in in this vision, he was at Shushan, the citadel, which would have been the capital at that time, next to the river Ulai. And this, at the time, once again, would have been the Persian capital at that time. Now, keep in mind, this is still during the reign of Belshazzar. So it's not after the fact that he's making this prophecy, but it's getting close to the time where the first part of this prophecy is going to be fulfilled. And so that I think that makes it pretty clear that being in the Persian capital, where the vision was, that it makes it even more clear who this ram is that he sees in the vision. Now, notice the ram had 2 horns, and one was raised up higher than the other. And we can make that same comparison to in chapter 7, the bear who had one side raised up higher than the other. And the bear in chapter 7 is the ram in chapter 8. They are one and the same. You know, different symbol, same place being symbolized. So this is very interesting. So it's another take on the empires, the kingdoms that were to come yet, and actually one that was already beginning to prosper. So the ram, notice here in verse 4, it pushed west, north, and south. It was unstoppable force. And what's significant about that is that Cyrus, the king of Persia, he went out and conquered from his capital, and those are the directions he conquered in: west, north, and south. Notice it doesn't mention east because he didn't go any further east. And so this is very descriptive of the king of Persia at that time, Cyrus the Great. And you're probably familiar with that name from the book of from Ezra and from Nehemiah. It was Cyrus the Great that allowed the Jews to go back to their homeland and rebuild the temple and the walls of the city and so forth. And even Cyrus the Great is mentioned by name and is all, in a sense, is a chosen vessel of God to carry out that very thing, so his people could go back to Israel. So this is during his reign. He's already in power at this time, Cyrus. So he's already around, and yes, his conquests were just beginning, and it was a combination of the Medes and the Persians, but the Persians were the superior of the two groups. And so thus the ram with the 2 horns, one was raised up higher than the other. That's because one was the Persians, the higher horn, and then the other one was the Medes. Okay, so the ram's going to meet up with the goats. So it's a battle going to ensue between the ram and the goat. And the goat, it says, came from the west. Okay, well, the west, and it's kind of spoiling it already because we know what's coming here, but the west of Persia was Greece and Macedonia. And this goat was going to come from the west, and it says across the whole earth and never touch the surface of the ground. It was conquering. And that is very similar to the leopard we saw in the previous chapter, in chapter 7, with the wings, the speed of conquest. So this goat's moving very quickly. Just as the leopard did in chapter 7, the leopard and the goat are one and the same. They're talking about the same kingdom. And once again, this is a reference, without a doubt, in my mind, to Alexander the Great and his conquests. And they were very rapid. So we move on, and I'm going to go through this quickly because it does interpret it for us. Okay, now they came at the ram with furious power. And this reminds me, and I brought this up last week, but I like the story. So this reminds me of the second major battle between Alexander's army and the Persian army, where Alexander spotted the Persian king at the back of the line, and he rode his horse right at him. The Persian king saw him coming and retreated. And, I mean, Alexander was very determined. He was as fierce as any warrior that ever lived in ancient times. In fact, he might have been the greatest of all the warriors, even among all of his men, yet he was the king and the leader. Back in those days, sometimes those things went together. Nowadays, it'd be, or afterwards, it's like stand in the back and say, go get him, boys. But not Alexander. He was right up front. And so when he came at that ram with furious power here in the book of Daniel, I think of that historically, that beeline on his horse, his war horse Bucephalus. And he was determined to get the king. And the king of Persia fled for his life. And the battle was a rout then in favor of Alexander and company. And eventually that king of Persia would be killed on the road. And eventually Alexander would take over his empire. But that's what I think of, the fury of that goat, how it came at the ram, the determination. Alexander, from the time of his youth, was very focused and very ambitious. He wanted nothing more than to conquer. In fact, he used to complain because his father, Philip, who also was a great conqueror, Philip of Macedon, used to complain, he's not going to leave anything for me. He literally was worried about that his father would conquer too much and he wouldn't have anything left to conquer. So that was his life. He was a soldier through and through. So, and he was extremely determined. And that's what I see in this description of the goat. It fits Alexander to a T. And of course, the goat represents his kingdom, but he's the king of that kingdom. All right, well, we notice that the ram couldn't stand against him. Well, they couldn't. Alexander obliterated the Persian Empire in 5 short years. Alexander became the king of Macedonia at age 20. 336 BC is when that happened. By 331 BC, he had conquered the entire Persian Empire, all of it, which at that time was the largest on the face of the earth. So all of that, what it talks about with the ram went conquering, and when it conquered west, it pushed west and north and south. That was a lot of real estate that was covered there. Alexander took it all away in a very short time. Easy come, easy go, man. That's the way it goes, right? For the Persians. So it says here in verse 8 that the male goat became great. The ram couldn't stand up against him. His horns were broken off, and that's the sign. He's got no more power. You broke off the ram's horns, it's over. No more power. And so Persia was no more. In fact, what Alexander did, he even had his leading generals marry Persian women. He wanted to kind of blend the two together because he had even greater ambitions than conquering just Persia. He was going to go over the Hindu Kush mountains to the east and take on the Afghans of Prince Boris and so forth. So his conquests were not over yet. And what was interesting about Alexander, even the Persian soldiers that he incorporated into his army, they didn't speak the same language, but they seemed to know exactly what he wanted to do. He was that great of a leader. So I don't think there's any doubt that anybody can argue who the male goat is, regardless of whether they're liberal, conservative, sound, unsound. They'd have to be out of their mind to not know who that male goat was. So I think that's a no-brainer. But now it gets very interesting. After verse 7, we get into verse 8. It talks about the large horn on the male goat was broken into 4, replaced by 4 notable horns, but they weren't as strong. They weren't going to be as strong as the one horn. They were smaller. On Alexander's deathbed, according to legend, in fact, this is even written in the book of Maccabees. I'll read this part to you from the book of Maccabees, because this is, my glasses on. This is from Maccabees, 1 Maccabees chapter 1, And the title is, it says The Conquest and Death of Alexander. So I'll just read what it says. And based on what it says, from what I know, it's very accurate. So, all right. After Alexander the Macedonian, Philip's son, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated Darius, king of the Persians and Medes, he became king in his place, having first ruled in Greece. He fought many campaigns, captured fortresses, and put kings to death. He advanced to the ends of the earth, gathering plunder from many nations. The earth fell silent before him, and his heart became proud and arrogant. And stop right there. This is very true about Alexander. I know I'm reading from a Maccabees, but he even proclaimed himself a god, and his men, when they came into his tent, they had to bow down a certain way and kiss his feet and do all kinds of crazy things. He was getting really full of himself, and he was starting to drive them crazy by the end of his time in power. So they were getting sick of him, too. But that doesn't take away from his conquest, but this is a good description of him, is what I'm saying. So based on that, I'm going to give this first Maccabees the benefit of the doubt historically and say they're probably right on with what they're saying here. Okay, so there he goes. He became proud and arrogant. It said he collected a very strong army and conquered provinces, nations, and rulers, and they became his tributaries. So in other words, they were paying money to him now. He was in command. He therefore summoned his but after all this, he took to his bed, realizing that he was going to die. And the last few days of his life, he was in bed. He couldn't even get out of bed. Whatever he contracted that was going to kill him, well, he knew it. He knew he was going to die. Some say he had pneumonia. Some say he had West Nile virus. There's speculation. I've thought about it because of his lifestyle that it might have even been some kind of form of venereal disease that might have killed him. But regardless, on his deathbed, his leading generals gathered around him, and he basically wanted to divide things up. It says here, but after he took to his bed when he was going to die, he therefore summoned his officers, the nobles who had been brought up with him from his youth, to divide his kingdom among them while he was still alive. It said Alexander had reigned 12 years when he died. So his officers took over his kingdom, each in his own territory, and after his death, they all put on royal crowns, and so did their sons after them for many years, causing much distress over the earth. So this is written after the fact, so this is recording what had happened. Now, is it totally accurate? Not necessarily, but is it generally accurate to the point where you can say that's correct? But definitely. And when he died, eventually, there were those that were close to him in his army that took over various regions of his empire. And we made mention of some of those last week. There was Cassander, and there was Ptolemy, and there was Lysimachus, and there was Seleucus. Okay, now Ptolemy is the one you probably have heard the most about because Ptolemy ruled in Egypt. Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemies. Okay, yes, the Diadochoi, the successors of Alexander. Thanks, Matt. Good timing. I didn't even ask for that. He's all over this. Okay, as he listed there. So this came about after a series of wars were fought. Alexander died in 323 BC, just short of his 33rd birthday. These fellows here, a lot of them, they were very well known to him. They battled it out to gain some of that territory because there were more than just these four at one point that were battling to take command of certain regions. These four emerged out of the war of the Diadochoi, as it's called, which means the successors of Alexander. So this is right on the money. Now, this next guy on this this outline, if you want to call it this skeletal outline, this informal outline, Antiochus IV. We're going to talk more about him later. We mentioned him last week, and he is very likely, almost definitely, that small horn that came up later. So we can go back now to Daniel, the book of Daniel, and we talk in verse 9 and 10. It talks about a little horn that grew out of the four, and it grew exceedingly great toward the southeast and glorious land. Now, when it's talking about the glorious land, that's talking about the land of Palestine, where the Jews live. And it says it grew to the host of heaven. It cast down some of the hosts and stars and trampled them. Now, when it cast down some of the hosts and stars, does anybody have any idea what that might mean in apocalyptic language? I think this is something significant here. And it's used in other parts of the Bible too, this figurative language here. Anybody have any idea?
So he conquered other kings and regions, people that were under power.
Mm-hmm. But when it talks about the host and stars, oftentimes that's talking about God's people.
Yeah, the saints I have in my Bible.
Yes.
It's referring to the saints.
And there is another reference to that. See these again. If you look at Genesis 15 and verse 5, and also Matthew 13 and verse 43, there's some similar type of language there in those. If I could just get, if one of you want to track down Genesis 5 and verse, or 15 and verse 5, and if someone else can track down Matthew 13:43, and just we'll read that quickly, and we'll see a similar type of language there.
I've got Genesis 15:5.
Okay, fire away, Matt.
Okay, and he brought him outside and said, "Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be."
Okay, so the stars of heaven, the way were used in reference to the descendants of Abraham, God's people. Okay, all right, now let's take a look at Matthew 13:43.
I got that, Mike.
Thanks, Darren. Go ahead.
Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who has ears to hear, let him hear.
Okay, so the righteous, these are the people of God, and shine forth like the stars. So if someone's trampling down the host and the stars, who are they trampling? They're trampling, in a sense, the people of God. So this is a reference to one of the things that this little horn is going to do. Okay, so it mentions some other specifics about him as it goes through the next few verses here. He exalts himself as high as Prince of the Host. He talks about taking daily sacrifices away. And it talks about the Prince of the Host, his sanctuary is cast down. So he's even, when it's talking about the Prince of the Host and his sanctuary is cast down, he's even going up against God himself. He's putting himself in a position where he's blaspheming and he's making himself higher than God himself. He's going to get a rude awakening eventually. But there's some explanation as to why he was even able to do that in the first place. Okay, so it says in verse 12 that the little horn cast truth down with his army. And it says in verses 13 and 14 that the sanctuary would be trampled for 2,300 days. Now, that number is interesting. It's just short of 7 years. And if you look at it figuratively, you think if the number 7 represents completeness, something permanent and long-lasting, this is just short of that, temporary. Or some say, and there's another take on this, that it is a literal period of time, because this Antiochus Epiphanes, it talks about his reign, part of his reign, between 170 BC and 164 BC. So probably a time just extending past 6 years. So it could be one or the, it could be either or. It kind of fits both, but I can't go out on a limb and say for sure exactly what the 2,300 days mean. It might be a combination of both, because sometimes in apocalyptic language, there are dual meanings. You know, they can fit different. They can be literal and figurative at the same time. I think we see things like that in Revelation. But nevertheless, it's not going to be permanent. We know that for sure. But for time, the people of God are going to get trampled, and that is a significant prophecy because we're going to see how that was fulfilled when we look at the secular history. Okay, through verse 14, okay, we skimmed a lot, but we're going to the explanations of the next verses. So I've been doing most of the talking, so what says you guys? Did I lose anyone yet? I hope not. Chris, you're not lost, are you?
Yeah, well, no, but this was way back at the beginning. I wanted to make sure I understood what you were saying. This is still during the Chaldean dynasty or whatever.
The vision, when Daniel has the vision, yes.
Okay.
550, yes, 550.
Why
yes.
would he have been living in the Persian capital?
No, the Persian capital is in his vision.
Oh, okay. He wasn't
It was in the
literally.
vision. He saw himself in the vision at
Got it.
Shushan.
Okay,
Yep.
okay. And another
Exactly.
question. When you talked about Alexander charging at the Persian king on his horse, is there like a name for that battle?
Yes. Issus.
Yeah.
Issus. ISSUS. Battle
Okay,
of
that's
Issus.
what I was wondering if it was that.
It's almost flipped. Okay, yes, that was the second major confrontation between Alexander and the Persian army. And then the last battle in 331 BC, there's more than one name for it, but one of the names is Gaugamela. And after Gaugamela, Alexander had overrun the entire Persian Empire. And I could sit here and tell you stories about Alexander's conquest and the things he actually did, which are just blow me away because the military history and the strategy and everything. But we're gonna skip that because we'll get too far off the beaten path here. So, however, I mean, these little references to him, they bring to me vivid pictures of him in battle. This little 5 foot, probably 5 foot 4 inch strawberry blonde that looked like a cherub and it was as fierce as they could come. He looked like a little angel, and well, he fought like a demon basically. But anyway, he was as fierce as they came. So, all right. So Daniel doesn't know what all this means, of course, but then he's going to give an explanation. And that's what makes this a little bit easier for the rest of us, because there's an angel going to tell him what it means. So, it's easy because it's recorded. Of course, we don't often have angels come and talk to us, right, and tell us what things mean. But Daniel had that, so we can go with his angel because we know it's an inspired account here. So Gabriel, one of only two angels mentioned by name in the Bible. Gabriel's one, and the other one's Michael. Okay. But Gabriel stood before Daniel to explain everything to him. And then verses 15 through 19, he gives that explanation. Nelson, you got those handy? Can I get you to read those verses for us? Daniel 8:15 through 19.
Sure.
Okay, thanks.
Then it happened, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me and stood me upright. And he said, look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for at the appointed time the end shall be.
Okay, so Daniel had quite an experience in this dream. All right, now it was a vision, but this was real. I mean, it was real what he was seeing. He was speaking with an angel, the angel Gabriel. And I'm guessing, just speculating, and I think it's more that the same angel that announced to Mary and Joseph that the Christ was going to be born. So this must have been this was like one of the top, must have been top of the list as far as angels go. And I imagine the appearance of this Gabriel must have been pretty awesome. And it made Daniel fearful, but he gives him encouragement. He says, "I'm going to explain these things to you." Okay, now we've kind of already alluded to what these explanations are, but it makes it official right here in the book itself. Okay, the ram had the two horns, and the kings of Media and Persia. And, notice one was raised up higher than the other because Persia was superior to Media at that time. So that's symbolic of them, just as the bear was symbolic of Persia in Daniel chapter 7. And then verse 21, the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn is the first king. And then as it broke, he said 4 stood in its place. 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. And that's extremely 100%. That's 100% accurate. And the 4 kingdoms that Matt put them up there for us here just a few minutes ago. That's what happened, and that's historic fact. And not one of them were anywhere near as powerful as Alexander's kingdom would have been. The one huge kingdom, but they were split into 4 parts. Each one, though, they took on royal titles, and their sons and their daughters after them inherited the throne. So they reigned as king. So they were kingdoms indeed. Now, the 4 of them, once again, were Lysimachus and Cassander and Ptolemy and Seleucus. And today's focus, the rest of today, will be on Seleucus for the most part, because this little horn that comes up was one of the Seleucids. Okay, so if we see this in verse 22, we just read, there's 4 kingdoms that stood up in his place. So Alexander's successors, who came out of the wars of the Diadochoi, as they were called. And then it says, in the latter time, their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise. Here we go. A king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. Okay, that's that little horn that's coming up. Okay, his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. So once again, this is God's people, the holy people. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. So here we go. We got another pompous person here. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. Okay, we'll stop at that point to talk about Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay, Matt, could you put up that outline again, that part we start with Antiochus Epiphanes. We had it up last week briefly, but this will make it a little bit easier as we talk about him. Okay, now he was a descendant of Seleucus. His father, Antiochus III, was known as Antiochus the Great and was a legitimate military leader. Antiochus IV, though, he was more of a wannabe. He's known as Epiphanes. That's what he called himself. That's part of that pompous nature he had, which means select of God, or God, or it could also mean God manifest. His enemies, or those that really knew him well, called him Epiphanes, which means the mad. He's a madman. So Syria was the center of the Seleucid kingdom. And when he took over, he did go out and he did conquer. He conquered the Jews. He had conquests in Egypt. But what he wanted to do is to turn everything under his reign to the Greek culture, to Hellenize his kingdom. That included the Jews. Now, we talked about this briefly last week. There were certain Jews that wouldn't have any part of that. They would rather die than defile themselves and violate the law. The Orthodox Jews were called the Hasidians, which means the pious ones. However, there were plenty of Jews who were more than willing just to save their own necks to go along with it, and probably even enjoyed some of the traditions of Hellenism. Those were the Reform Party Jews. Well, among the things that Antiochus IV did in Jerusalem was to basically depose the Jewish high priest and appoint his own. And eventually a rebellion followed after that. You push, go ahead and, scroll up a little bit. So the Jews were, the pious Jews were, once again, they were always set against him. So he eventually took Jerusalem by force. He set up a garrison nearby, and then he really started cracking down. He started outlawing the traditions of the Jews. In fact, he did this everywhere. Everywhere he was, he tried to take down their local traditions and customs and replace them with that of his own. When he wanted to Hellenize everyone, he wanted everybody to buy into the Greek culture, and a lot of the Greek culture was quite immoral. One of the worst things, of course, in the eyes of the Jews was the desecration of the temple, the building of idols to Greek gods, Zeus, the sacrificing of swine on the altar, and it was just nasty stuff. Now, having said all that, we talked a little about that last week. Let's go back into this book of Maccabees that I was telling you about here, and and you can take that off for the time being, Matt. And in the book of Maccabees, it's going to talk about the Maccabean Revolt, which is partially covered in that little outline that I had there. But let's talk about Antiochus IV. These are specific things written about him in the book of Maccabees. I'm just going to read some of them from you. This is from Maccabees chapter 1 still. And it says that after Antiochus had defeated Egypt in the year 143, this is Jewish time. It's not the actual year. This was probably around 167 BC or so. But the year 143,
Which verse are
he
you
returned. What's that?
on? Which verse are you on in Maccabees 1?
Verse 20.
Thanks.
Verse 20. I'll say, if any of you have the book of Maccabees, that's right, chapter 1, verse 20. It said, after Antiochus had defeated Egypt in the year 143, he returned and went up to Israel and to Jerusalem with a strong force. He insolently invaded the sanctuary and took away the golden altar, the lampstand for the light with all its fixtures, the offering table, the cups and the bowls, the golden censers, the curtains, the crowns, and the golden ornament on the facade of the temple. He stripped off everything and took away the gold and silver and the precious vessels. He also took all the hidden treasures he could find. Taking all this, he went back to his own country after he had spoken with great arrogance and shed much blood. So, do you see any thing that seems very familiar to just those few verses we read in Daniel about this little horn that rose up right there? Okay, I'm going to skip down. I'm going to skip down a little bit. It does talk about there being great mourning. I'm going to skip down to, if anybody's following along, to verse 29 in 1 Maccabees chapter 1. It says, 2 years later, the king sent the Mysian commander to the cities of Judah, and he came to Jerusalem with a strong force. Listen to this. He spoke to them deceitfully in peaceful terms and won their trust. Then he attacked the city suddenly in a great onslaught and destroyed many of the people in Israel. Now, I wanted to emphasize that because if you look back at what the book of Daniel says, it talks about him acting in deceit. Okay, and this was part of his MO. He wasn't a very straightforward guy. There were a lot of military leaders out there that did some really nasty things to people, but they were more straightforward about it. They were coming for you, we're taking you down. But he played the down and dirty, sneaky game. So he wasn't all that. I mean, he gave himself the nickname Epiphanes, and I think we talked about that. It shouldn't count as a nickname if you give it to yourself. When you get it from somebody else, that means something. But when you call yourself God manifest, or manifest of God, well, that's just ego, and basically it means that you probably are insecure about yourself. And this is how those kind of people operate, basically. So his method of operation fits very, very neatly with what was written about this small horn in the book of Daniel. Okay, let me skip on some more. I'm going to skip to verse 41. It says the heading here is Prohibitions against religion. Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, each abandoning his particular customs. All the Gentiles conformed to the command of the king, and many Israelites were in favor of his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. The king sent messengers with letters to Jerusalem and to the cities of Judah, ordering them to follow customs foreign to their land, to prohibit holocausts, sacrifices, and libations in the sanctuary, to profane the Sabbath and feast days, to desecrate the sanctuary and the sacred ministers, to build pagan altars and temples and shrines, to sacrifice swine and unclean animals, to leave their sons uncircumcised, and to let themselves be defiled with every kind of impurity and abomination, so that they might forget the law and change all their observances. Whoever refused to act according to the command of the king should be put to death. I think that describes this small horn quite well. And that's all talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, as he called himself, Antiochus IV. Okay, so let's open it up for a moment before we go any further here. What are your thoughts on any of this? I'm sure I left out some details here and there because we did a lot of skimming, but I think in general, hopefully this brings this prophecy to life. I mean, really, it's like, wow.
You know, Mike, I've been doing some reading about this Antiochus and that, and one thing you were talking about when he attacked Jerusalem and that, the what I was reading, it said that he did it on the Sabbath, knowing that where they would be and what they would be doing. He had figured out when their weakest time was so that he could have better success and things like that. So, and that way he was able to really take control easily. And that, so I thought that was kind of interesting to him. You know, that was a sacred time and that, and that's when he decided that would be a great time to conquer them.
And it was. That kind of reminds me a little bit of modern times. I don't know if you guys, some of you guys, I'm probably dating myself, talking about the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when Israel was invaded by its Middle East neighbors. Now, I'm not a premillennialist, but anyway, it's similar because Yom Kippur was this major Jewish holiday, and so the enemy, that's when they attacked them. They knew they'd be occupied at the start of the war. And that wasn't even original. Antiochus Epiphanes did the same thing way back in his time in the 160s BC. So if you look back at Daniel now, you know, one of the things I want to point out now, going back in verse 23, when it talks about in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, part of the reason why, when you see that, when the transgressors had reached their fullness, part of the reason why this happened was because there were plenty of Jews that weren't living the right way. And this was a punishment from God to an extent. Now, the pious Jews, of course, some of them would die in this as well. But the reason why this was allowed to happen, based on that, what my take on this verse is that because just as when the Jews were taken off into captivity in Babylon, or just when they were defeated at Ai, and things like that, because of their wrongdoing, God gave them up to teach them a lesson at that time. And when I look at this, you know, I think, you know, this phrasing, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, you remember when God spoke to Abraham and said that the transgression of the Amorites was not yet full. In other words, there was going to come a time when it was going to be over and you're just going to go in and you're going to take them because I'm done with them. Well, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, God was done with them, so they were going to be punished. So this is the reason why Antiochus IV was able to prosper for a time, is because God could use even someone like him to serve his purposes. And I think that's a very consistent thing throughout the scriptures that we see. And God had forewarned his people about that if they turned to false gods and idolatry and turned away from him. So if they played the harlot with other gods and so forth. And that was going on. But there was still the remnant that was that was still staying strong in the Lord. Okay? Notice it talks about the king having fierce features who understand sinister schemes. Okay, he talks about how you shall destroy fearfully, and he'll prosper and destroy the mighty. And then 25 goes back to what you said, Dee, about when he attacked through his cunning, he shall, and deceit. It's describing him perfectly right there. So all of this, I think, it's fascinating. And, it shouldn't be surprising to us that God's prophecies are fulfilled to a T, but it's very encouraging when we can point others to this and say, all right, you don't believe this? What's this mean then? Okay, you can plant the seed, and then they can make their decision, but we've got evidence. We've got ammunition here to fight the good fight of faith. And, just by, I just love this. So.
Hey, Mike, I had one more thing. When you were talking about the 2,300 days back in, where was that?
Verse 14.
12 through 14 or whatever, where it says that, there's going to be 2,300 days or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about that song, In His Time. And when we sing that song, we're always looking like how God works in our time. And that for me kind of thing. In His time, things will happen the way God wants them to in my life. And that we think of. But when you look backwards in that life, everything happens in God's time. He has set a time for everything to happen, whether it's real specific like this days and things like that, or whatever it is, everything happens in His time. And that, so we can look backwards through life and that through the Bible and see that things happen according to God's time. And we can look at ourselves and in the future that things will happen in God's time. And that's something we can trust in, and that, and that there's He has a specific set of things that things happen the way that He wants them to. Sometimes it takes some trust on our behalf that we let things happen the way God wants them to instead of trying to control it. But this gave peace to those, knowing that it was a limited amount of time. It wasn't forever. They wouldn't have to endure forever, and that. And if they were able to look at this during that time period when Antiochus was there, this would give them comfort in knowing that God had limited their time and that. So I just think that's kind of interesting.
And when he goes on, and at the end of verse 25, it says, it's still talking about this little horn, which we've identified as Antiochus Epiphanes. It said, he shall even rise against the prince of princes. Well, it's obvious when he's desecrating the temple. Is he going against the Jews, or is he going against the God of the Jews? We know what that is all about. But it says, but he shall be broken without human means. He died of an illness in 164 BC to fulfill the prophecy fully right there. So he had his temporary time, whether it was the 2,300 days literally or figuratively, but he went down without human hands, without human means. Now, there's something to this also, because if he was the warrior that he wanted to be, like his dad was Antiochus the Great, and you only get that title, the Great, especially in ancient times, if you win military victory. But here he is dying of natural causes of an illness. And that's kind of like to say, you think you were so cool? You weren't so great after all, dude. So, I mean, that's what that's saying to me. And once again, even if it's not quite saying that, God's taking him down and humbling him in the end. He's going down, and he's going to be in power temporarily, whereas God is there eternally. Christy made sure, she said, make sure you tell him what it means being without human means being broken. So that's my take on that, and that's how he died of an illness. So I think that plays right into, nobody killed him. He just died. Human means. Nothing special there. Okay, so now Daniel was going to be distraught over his vision, but this last part here, in verses 26 and 27. 26, this is the grand finale, even though 27 is the last verse. All right, this is really important, I think, for us. And the vision of the evenings and mornings, which was told, is true. Okay, we know that. It comes from God. His angel revealed it to Daniel. Therefore, as a result, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. Okay, seal up the vision. All right, now, I want to make a comparison here. Did I lose my verse? I hope I didn't lose the verse. I think it is, shoot, I had it written up. I think it's Revelation 22:7, I believe. Let me double check. I'm flipping there right now, because I want to make what I think is a very important comparison here. No, that's not the one I wanted. Okay. But in Revelation, I'm sorry, I had it written right here, and my page flipped on me, and 22:10?
Yeah.
22:10. Okay, thank you. I was close. All right. So, does somebody want to read Revelation 22:10? Do you have it handy?
I can read it. I got it.
Okay, go ahead.
And he said to me, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near.
Uh-huh. I like that. Notice. Okay, now, this prophecy, Daniel's vision, we can pinpoint to about 550 BC. The end of the prophecy that was told him, as it was fulfilled in this vision, was with the death of Antiochus Epiphanes in 164 BC, so less than 400 years. And what's the angel Gabriel tell Daniel? Seal it up. It's many days from now. Okay, so if almost 400 years is many days from now, what does it mean in Revelation 22:10 when they say don't seal it up, the time is at hand? Is that something that's going to happen in our time, or something that's going to happen very quickly? And so I think that is such a powerful verse when we compare Daniel and Revelation, because of some of the false doctrines that are out there about, premillennialism. I can't say that. I'm like George W. Bush trying to say nuclear proliferation. Okay, but anyway, I think that's very significant, and I had to give credit to that one who first brought that to my attention with one of the brothers from Fredericktown. It had a big discussion with his barber about it. So that was it. So I always have to get the Larry the Barber story from Jim Eister. He told me about it. So anyway, I think that's as significant as anything to help us understand not only Daniel, but Revelation down the road. So once again, if many days from now is less than 400 years, what is time is at hand? It can't be more than that, or God's not consistent with his timekeeping. Something's wrong if it's not. So that's something to think about, and I thought that was very important. Okay, to finish off chapter 8 then, Daniel wasn't feeling good after all this. He said he fainted and was sick for days afterward. But then he rose up and went after the king's business, but was astonished at the vision. No one understood it, though. So, Daniel didn't have all the answers. He gave us a picture of things to come, and these were going to be things that happened long after he was gone. So, it's probably hard for him to picture, but why was he so distraught? It's like it made him sick to his stomach. Why? Just a vision, right? What do you think?
I think that he knew that he could trust God and that whatever he saw was real. He knew it was going to happen. And it seems like the ones that distress him the most are the ones where he knows God's people are going to go through a tough time. And it's just, it's hard for him to look ahead, just like it is for us to think that our descendants might not have it as easy as we do in worshiping God here in our country or something. But it's hard for him to look ahead and know that things are going to be hard, and that he's looking for peace to come, and people returning to Jerusalem. And then he gets to see these really vivid images and that, and the fact that God was able to elevate him so that he would know where he was. you know, when you think of that, he wasn't one of those Jews that were just wandering around in Babylon or whatever. You know, he was given such a high position so that when he was having this dream, or, you know, he knew where he was. He could recognize it because of his elevation in the Babylonian Empire, and that you know, being in command up high in that. I think that's kind of interesting. But for us, it's so easy to look back and say, Alexander the Great, you know, it's, look at what happened, you know, I know, yeah, we can say, oh, we know for certainty that it means this, but that's easier for us in hindsight. And I was reading in a book that was commentating on that. They're like, it's so much easier after the fact to look back and pinpoint what this means than it is for someone that's living before it happens to look ahead and trust in God that he's going to carry everything out the way he wants. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah. And, you know, those prophecies that were made there, it's not like things people forecast every day. You know, it's just, there's no doubt, you know, who was in control. And, you know, and Daniel was distraught. Like you said, the people of God were going to suffer.
Mike?
And that was disturbing to him. Go ahead.
Me? Okay, in chapter 8, verse 27, when it's just Daniel that is seeing this, the angel has told him about this, showing this to him, and Daniel is seeing this himself, who are by the vision, but no one understood it. That's more than one person, isn't it?
Well, my guess, when it says no one understood it, is, I'm thinking when he said no one understood it, it obviously included him, but it's kind of suggests to me that he shared the vision with someone.
Mike?
Go ahead, Chris.
The ESV says, I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. So the ESV is indicating that it was Daniel that did not understand it.
Okay. But, okay, so yeah, the wording's a little different there. So, well, there's no doubt, regardless of what version, that Daniel was still confused by it. And you know what? And we have something he didn't have. We have hindsight. Okay, and you know, God only revealed so much to him. He didn't tell him everything, but he told him enough, you know, to carry out his will. We have the full story. He didn't have the full story. He only had part of the prequel. we have the whole story.
Mike?
Yes.
I can understand Daniel being, you know, the religious, pious person that he was, at how distraught he could be with the destruction of his fellow brethren, you know, the Jewish people again. And if he had any inkling of them profaning the Sabbaths and, you know, giving up God, and, you know, that would be distressing to me too. You know, if I heard my Christian brethren were going through something like that or doing something like that, you know, it would hurt my heart.
Definitely.
I'd like to dovetail off of what Brenda said. I keep thinking, as I look at the United States and I look at denominations and how they have become more and more liberal, and I don't know if the rest of you see it, but it looks to me like the church is becoming more liberal, and we turn a blind eye to things we used to not turn a blind eye to, things like that. I wonder if we shouldn't be just as appalled and down on our knees and praying for the church. And I guess I've looked for a number of years for persecution or something to come either to the United States or, you know, which would include the church in the United States, or just to the church. You know, I look at, is China going to overtake us? Is Iran going to overtake us? And, you know, these things don't worry me because I know God's in control. But I think I should be more distraught about the condition of the church and praying that it remains true. And I guess when the COVID thing came along, I mean, I would have said a year ago, nothing would close the Church of Christ. And the COVID thing came along, and there's still this, there seems to be a division in the church about, you know, well, you know, we shouldn't have listened to the government. We should have defied them because they were trying to close down the church. And then others believe that, well, they never told us we couldn't worship. They were just trying to keep us from spreading, you know, but there's other ways we can worship. And that is hurting the church even today, I think. So I think we should learn a lesson from Daniel's being appalled, that we also need to care deeply about what's going on in the church.
Hey, Mike.
Yes. Go ahead.
What she was talking about, we have some of that actually going on today. There's a church, I think I heard out in California, that they're going after the preacher at that church for allowing assembly, and they're going to fine them like $3,000 for allowing people to get together for worship. But I think that's just the beginning of things. If we really start listening into the news and stuff, a lot of it's starting out little, but I think it's working its way up through for the church, and the church is starting to be persecuted. And some people may not see it, but I think it's going on. And, you know, we need to start praying that we don't get to that point. But when the governors start telling people they're going to fine them, and that's not the only church that I heard about where people were getting fined for meeting together. So it's slowly happening now. So we need to have that in our heart, the fact that we need to be praying for the church, because who knows, with everything crazy going on, how it's going to end up.
And it's the division within the church that worries me, that upsets me the most. I don't care what the government does to us. I don't care what the outside does to us. But Satan will allow us to, will help us tear ourselves apart if we allow that division within the church. And that's what disturbs me the most, more than outright persecution.
You know, Chris, that's a very good application you made. You really opened up a can of worms, though, I tell you that. But, you know, next week in Daniel chapter 9, I think some of those discussions will be even more relevant, because we're going to see Daniel's prayer about the sins of his people. And so I think, you know, keep some of those things in mind, and we might discuss our way through this and get part way through this next week, but that's all good. The applications are great. But I think we're going to have to wrap it up now. So I would normally say, does anybody else have any more comments? But based on where we ended, maybe we can kind of pick up along those lines next week and think of those things as we look into Daniel chapter 9 and we get some discussions going, because I think they're very relevant to next week. And we are at 8:05, so we're going to cut off there. So I'm going to ask Yuri to